Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky Textbooks, Revision Guides and Practice Papers. Everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your SQA exams. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LeckyPodcast40.
We're so used to flying on holiday or on work and just comparing to where we end up and talking about how different it is. Whereas the cool thing about sort of man-powered journeys, you get to see how everything joins up.
In this summer holiday special, we will travel around the planet taking inspiration from the 1872 adventure novel Around the World in 80 Days. We will hear how the challenges of secondary school led one man to develop a love for adventure, which in turn rewarded him with the confidence to follow his own passions. And we will continue to develop our understanding of the world around us and learn about some of the amazing trees we too often take for granted. In his book, Around the World in 80 Days, Jules Verne wrote, "If the thing is feasible, the first to do it ought to be an Englishman." And when it comes to cycling, although Scottish blacksmith Kirkpatrick Macmillan can be attributed with having created the first bicycle, it was Devon-based Steve Strange who was the first person to cycle around the world in line with the Guinness World Record rules. However, when it comes to holding the prestigious world record today, it is Scotsman Mark Beaumont who trumped Phileas Fogg and cycled around the world in 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. While Jenny Graham, a Scottish mum and adventure enthusiast, holds the current record for cycling around the world unsupported, which she completed in 124 days. On this Higher Biology podcast summer holiday special, we'll be going around the world with Mark himself. So let's say hello.
Hi there. Good to see you again remotely.
Before we set off, I wanted to hear a little bit more about where Mark came from and his own experience of school.
Grew up in rural Perthshire. I was homeschooled for primary years, so I never went to school till I was 12. And that obviously gave me a pretty unique start to life. You know, myself and my sisters working and playing on the farm until we were 12, and then got dropped into the playground for the first time. And enjoyed high school.
It was the Dundee High School you went to, Mark, was it?
Yeah, absolutely. And but massive transition from being this little country boy, just around the kitchen table doing my subjects, to suddenly on the rugby field playing football. Getting used to the politics of the playground. I found that transition challenging, and I guess my escape, but also a great love from that early age, was adventure and the great outdoors. And we're spoilt in Scotland in terms of what that is. So, even when I went to high school, it was closer to go up skiing at Glenshee than it was to go to school. So I now realise, with two daughters of my own, an extraordinary amount of freedom. And I think adventure sports was a bit of a coping mechanism as well when I was finding high school a wee bit tough. And I started going on journeys. So I did them because they were great fun to plan, and I would always try and support some local charities. I was Dundee to Oban across Scotland when I was 12, Land's End to John O'Groats when I was 15, so like halfway through high school. And then by the time I was leaving high school, going the length of Europe around Scandinavia. And then I was just leaving Glasgow University with a economics and politics degree when I decided to cycle around the world the first time.
To go from cycling across Scotland at 12 to cycling across the world a few years later is quite an achievement.
Yeah, so that was sort of 10 years between the age of, say, 12 and 22. So, I mean, I was quite academic at school. Like there was, like I was,
Any
even though
favourite subjects?
not biology.
Oh, that's it.
Crushing.
We're gonna have to start again.
We'll end the interview there. No, I was never very good at biology. I don't know why. So I did higher physics and chemistry. You'll be
I'm just
gutted to
flicking
hear.
through my notes, figuring out why you're here.
So, no, my main subject at school, which I was passionate about, was art. I was dux of art at my school. I loved art, but because I was decent at English and physics, my dad in particular was very keen that I did something more academic. So I would have gone to art school if I could have, or architecture was my real passion. But I ended up studying economics and politics because I got good grades, and I think that's an interesting topic in itself.
You obviously had a lot of talent at school, just from the sheer list of achievements you've just rounded off. But that kind of pressure to go down a certain route, that's not certainly not something you've stuck to.
No, because I think as you grow up, I always encourage young people to, put themselves in the driving seat. You can't have that pupil teacher mindset forever. I'm sure as a teacher, you want people to always listen to you, Paul. But at some point,
Doesn't
you're
always happen.
no, you're your own boss, and the quicker people can sort of give themselves that responsibility, make real choices, make personal choices. So it ain't easy. We've all got peer pressure being parents and teachers and financial and society, puts a lot of expectations in terms of what young people should do. But, just get used to being furiously busy with what's in front of you, commit, as long as you've got a habit of just really sort of getting stuck in with whatever opportunities come your way and whatever opportunities you create. You don't need to have a 5-year, 10-year career plan. You just need to get good at getting stuck in. And, the path less trodden is quite scary. So yeah, I plan to work in finance, and I've ended up traveling to 130 countries and making films and writing books and being a broadcaster and working with a lot of interesting businesses. So I'm now age 37. And right now, I am. I'm a partner in an early stage investment fund because I love entrepreneurship and early stage businesses, and I'm passionate about supporting businesses that are getting spun out from Scottish universities. So there's one thing I do. I'm making films. I'm just back from Chile before Christmas, where we were trying to free ride the world's highest volcano. Pretty cool, 7,000 meter descent on free ride bikes.
That is pretty cool. Actually, one of the coolest career options I've come across recently was a volcano vlogger. Believe it or not.
Oh yeah,
apparently that's a thing.
Yeah, that's a speciality, isn't it? Aldo Kane, a fellow adventurer, he's basically carved out a career in being a volcano specialist. If ever you're doing filming in volcanoes, because of the toxic gases and whatnot, you have to have Aldo, a fellow Scot, go in there with you. So what a weird and wonderful way to make a living. And I'm writing another book at the moment, all about endurance and endurance sport, which is quite interesting. I love writing. And if you'd asked me at high school, would I write a book? Couldn't stand writing. But when you find a topic you enjoy, it's amazing.
All those challenges and all those personal choices that you've made along the way. I guess it's that kind of hard work and commitment, time and time again, no matter what it was that you were doing, that just continued to kind of open more opportunities and ultimately have determined your kind of destination to adventurer, author, broadcaster. The list goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if I'd been too, when I'd left school and university, if I'd been too fixed on one thing, then I think in the last 20 years, I would have missed all the good stuff. The good stuff is what happens when you build a skill set and you've got an ambition and you're out there doing things and people come to you. And, I think that's the fun part. I've never had a 5-year plan. I've just been quite good at getting stuck in with the next big idea.
Yeah, and sometimes some of that hard work and when you really have to dig deep and get stuck in, it doesn't always feel like fun at the time. But I guess looking back, sometimes it's the hardest bits are actually the bits that give you most satisfaction at the end.
Yeah, definitely. The way I think about it and the way I talk about it with businesses I work with is, you set out in life thinking that, material wealth is going to make you happy. my sort of way of thinking about it, especially during periods like right now where you've got a ton of uncertainty, a ton of unhappiness, a ton of what is the world going to look like. On an individual level, you want to create impact in three ways. And you don't do those things just because it makes you a goody two shoes. You do those things because actually it makes you happy. And those three ways are your work. Now, that might be schoolwork, or it might be, big bad work when you grow up. Family, they matter, whether you get on with them all the time or not. And community. Now, community can be local community, the UK, Scotland at large, or globally. But if you come off back of periods like now, where there's a ton of upset, a ton of worry, a ton of uncertainty, and you focused on one or two of those things, but not all three of them, then I don't care whether you've got a Ferrari in the garage. You're not going to feel good about your impact on the world. So if you think of impact, I know this is a biology podcast, isn't it? But if you create impact, if you think about each week and go, how am I affecting my family? How am I affecting my work? And how am I affecting the wider conversation, community at large? Then you'll come off the back of tough periods like this feeling like, that period of time was worthwhile. I did something kind of life affirming and good. And if it's just about work, that's adults making money, or just about, family because you're entirely focused on what happens, within these four walls, then it doesn't really give you the connectedness that you need. So I think we've all got a responsibility. If you can sort of think in your mind, right, have I created impact with my family? Have I created impact with the work that's important? And have I, outside of all that good stuff, created an impact with the wider challenges? I think you'll feel pretty good in yourself. That's the way I think about life.
Phileas Fogg set off from London on Wednesday the 2nd of October 1872. Before we set off on our own journey, let's pick up Jonathan Drori in London to help talk us through some of the trees we might come across.
So my name's Jonathan Drori. I'm originally trained as an engineer, actually, electronics, and then moved into television programme making, where I was a television director for documentaries at the BBC for a while, and then became more and more interested in the environment and have ended up on various sort of boards of botanical gardens and so on. And I wrote a book called Around the World in 80 Trees, which is about 80 different tree species around the world and how their lives are kind of intertwined between plant science and history and culture and so on.
What gave you that inspiration to go on that journey?
I grew up in southwest London near Kew Gardens, and my parents were sort of obsessive about plants and trees. And later, as I managed to sort of travel a bit when I got older, I kind of combined the interest they'd given me in plants with my interest in travel, and somehow, the journey came out of that. And for me, the sort of feeling of stepping out on a beautiful morning in a strange forest somewhere in the world is the most marvelous feeling. And I suppose I wanted to write about some of my excitement with trees.
Trees are probably something we all take for granted. I guess trees would be one of humanity's most kind of constant and varied companions to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because human beings are programmed to look at things that move and react to them, that perhaps we're a bit blindsided by trees because they just sort of sit there and seem not to do anything. Whereas actually they have pretty exciting lives, but they're just spread out over many of our generations. So, things don't happen quite so quickly. But they get up to the most amazing and bizarre behaviours. And, they lie and cheat in the same way that people do. They have to defend themselves against attack. Just masses of similarities actually between tree life and animal life and human life.
And your journey around the world in 80 trees started in London?
It sort of started in London, and I mean, it's a little bit of a conceit because there are some of those trees that I've seen all the trees in the book, but some of them were in places that I couldn't get to, so I had to go to botanical gardens to see them. There's the remarkable tree in New Caledonia, which is in the South Pacific, called the Sève Bleue, which unfortunately I couldn't get to see in real life in its natural habitat. It's a very strange tree. It defends itself with an enormous amount of nickel that it absorbs from the soil in that particular place in New Caledonia. There's a massive amount of nickel in the soil, and it sequesters it inside the tree, and it kind of uses it to fend off insects and so on that might eat it. Otherwise, it's very poisonous. But this tree has so much nickel in it that one little tree could have kind of 30 kilos of nickel, and it's actually a sort of the sap is bright blue if you cut it, and has an enormous proportion of nickel in it. It's an incredible thing.
John will be coming with us to tell us more about trees on our journey around the world. Mark set off on his record-breaking cycle from Paris, heading east, and I was interested to hear about how he and his team banned handshaking 2 years before such precautions became far more common as we tackle coronavirus.
Yeah, it was just to keep me in a little bubble where I couldn't get unwell. You know, when you're super tired, not sleeping enough, pushing it physically as an athlete, your immunology takes a real hit. So any bugs, any upset, any, I mean, quite literally, when my team got, vomiting or diarrhea or any of the yucky stuff, they had to be quarantined. And a really obvious way to pass germs is shaking hands. So we all know that well now. But, when it comes to real performance sports, I mean, look at these athletes. They certainly don't shake hands and then touch their face. To the point where I landed back in Lisbon, the British ambassador in Lisbon came out to meet me at the airport. And I was so accustomed after 2.5 months of giving people fist pumps rather than handshakes that the British ambassador got a good old fist pump, which was pretty cool. She went for it.
With a target of cycling an average of 240 miles a day, Mark headed east from Paris towards Berlin, where we will take our first stop to hear from John about lime trees and what they mean to both bees and amorous Germans alike.
Yeah, I mean, lime trees are... the big mystery about lime trees is why the Germans put up with them. Because, lime trees are fantastic home for aphids. And aphids excrete kind of honeydew, sort of sugar solution. And this rains down from trees onto anything underneath. And obviously, if you're in the countryside, that doesn't matter at all. But if you're in a city, people often complain about lime trees. This is not lime the fruit, by the way. This is lime, linden is another name for the tree. They're common in Scotland. These trees, they sort of rain down this sticky mist, and people with cars hate them. And if there's this street called Unter den Linden, under the lime trees in Berlin, very famous street, and it's a very sort of posh shopping street, and all these incredibly expensive BMWs and Audis and Mercedeses get covered in this kind of sticky solution, which of course, once it's sticky, then everything else sticks to it. So you've got all the sort of dust and gruck and muck of the city covering these beautiful, what were once shiny cars. And the Germans put up with it. And the reason they put up with it is because in the same way that, the story goes that everyone in England, at least, I don't know about Scotland, had their first kiss behind the bicycle shed. The place that the Germans had their first kiss is under the lime tree. And you ask, and even if they didn't, that's the folk memory. And so lime trees have this position in German society, which is, people feel very, very affectionately towards them. It's just sort of one of those things. It's like the way that, the English feel about their sort of, I don't know, cricket and pubs and things, or Scotland maybe towards its, the sort of the Highlands or the haggis or something.
Did you manage to visit Unter den Linden, Mark?
I wasn't stopping much, as you might imagine. Like most bike riders in a hurry, I was seeing the world like a slideshow. So I can relate a lot to, the woodlands, the countryside. Both times I cycled around the world, I went west to east through Germany. I've got very fond memories of crashing my bike in Leipzig in the rain. I've got very fond memories of riding through big rainstorms where the cloud was down to the maize fields around me, and I was surrounded by the low drum of wind turbines in the fields. And it was like a scene out of War of the Worlds, which will mean nothing to younger listeners, but I would encourage them to go back and figure out what War of the Worlds was, an amazing storybook that I grew up with. So I've got very vivid memories of cycling through Germany both times.
You then went, obviously, you were straight into Poland before veering up north through Lithuania, Latvia, and heading east into Russia, which seems like quite a good time to quickly talk about Africa, because if you were to flip Russia on its head and drag it over Africa, Cape Town would be somewhere in the Russian Caucasus, and the easternmost point of Siberia would actually plunge into the Mediterranean north of Cairo. And that's obviously an African cycle, of course, which you hold the world record for too.
Yeah, Cairo to Cape Town, 6,000 miles top to toe, which, if you're thinking of the scale of the world, 6,000 miles is a third of the world in terms of distance. So the equator, which I'm sure you all know, is 24,901 miles, and all land-based circumnavigations. So you could walk around the world, you could cycle it, you could drive it, you could take a motorbike. They're all 18,000 mile records. So Africa, top to toe, is a third of that distance, and a record I broke back in 2015.
You must have come across some incredible wildlife, Mark, when you've been travelling through some of these landscapes.
Yeah, so the wildlife's always, some of my favourite parts. If I was to sort of take my two daughters to a moment in time on any expedition, it would probably be in northern Botswana, having just crossed the Zambezi River and, being pedaling along with a giraffe cantering alongside me, or with elephants on the road in front of me.
Which is just the most amazing piece of footage. It does look as if the giraffe is pacing you.
It's just that, perfect stride. So, these are the moments you can't plan for. And that's absolutely why I go on adventures, for those sort of hidden moments and the things you don't expect.
During our detour to Botswana, John described another tree and recalled something else which we don't always expect to be handed out for free in a London train station.
There's a particular sort of biome in Africa, in Botswana and that sort of central southern Africa, called the Mopani woodland, Mopane, Mopani woodland, and it's just a very lovely, gentle kind of woodland. The Mopani tree is home to a particular kind of moth that lays its eggs on the tree. The moth larvae just love these leaves, which they eat in huge quantity, and human beings eat the moth larvae. It's they sort of they don't just sort of eat them straight off the tree. They prepare them by first of all killing them quickly in boiling water, and then they sort of take the guts out by just sort of squeezing them with their fingers, and then they get dried, and then you can use them sort of for frying or as a snack, the way we eat crisps and so on. And millions of people in that area actually augment their diets with Mopani. They call them Mopani worms. They're not worms. They're sort of larvae, which contain a lot of protein. It's an important source of food. And actually, all over the world, there are communities of people, like millions of people. It's not just the odd little tribe here and there. Millions of people have insects as part of their diet. So you often see larvae of other insects being used in China. You see people using crickets and protein from crickets and so on, which are actually finding their way into some of our foods now. I got handed some at a railway station as some sort of energy bar with cricket protein recently in London. So we shouldn't be too squeamish about these things, and actually they're sort of interesting flavours and interesting sources of protein. So that's the Mapani forest, which is a lovely place to be.
And how was the cricket protein energy bar?
It was fine. I mean, to be honest, with the cricket protein energy bar, I can't really say it tasted different from any other energy bar.
Did you feel particularly energised after it?
I think I just sort of kind of taste. I don't think it had any effect on me that was different from any other energy bar. I felt quite sort of pleased because it was a freebie at the railway station. But the
ideal.
But if you have those sort of caterpillar larvae on their own, then you can taste what they're like, and they taste really like. Do you know? Have you ever had sort of matchstick chips, potato chips? They're sort of, they look like a matchstick and they're sort of deep fried. They have the texture and flavour of that, and you add a bit of salt, and that's what they're like, basically.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, they are. I mean, you just have to sort of get over the fact that they're caterpillars.
Let's get back to Russia and hear more about the challenge such a big country posed to Mark. And I think at the time you referred to it, certainly in your own book, Mark, as if it felt as if that was a kind of never-ending part of the journey.
Well, if you imagine, I got from Paris to the Russian border in less than a week. Clearing Europe and those little tapestry of countries at such pace gives a wonderful sense of progress. And in the first couple of days in Russia, you're in this sort of never-ending row of trees. It's one of the greatest juxtapositions, one of the greatest changes culturally you'll ever come across, leaving Europe and heading into that sort of Eastern Bloc and heading into Russia. Extraordinary. This sort of corridor of trees heading to Moscow is a bit like heading up through northern Canada into Alaska. And it's just, you pass the odd stall at the side of the road with somebody selling stuffed bears or other taxidermy. The odd ladder passing you, which again, for those who are not old enough to have seen a ladder on the British roads, is a wonderful sort of Soviet-era vehicle. And then you reach Moscow, which is like a spider's web of ring roads, and it's just an immensely crazy big city. And then you get east, and I thought we'd be into the wilderness, like the Ural Mountains, the West Siberian Plateau, that stretch north of Kazakhstan, and then heading to like Lake Baikal and the big military zone heading into the Mongolian border. That all sounds like wilderness to me. In fact, Russia remains populated, busy, industrial. I thought east of Moscow and St. Petersburg, you'd be into the wild, but actually, I was pedaling through there. And as you say in the question, like, it felt like time had slowed down because suddenly I was on a scale of a map entirely different to Europe. And my progress across it was painfully slow, despite the fact I wasn't going any slower.
Yeah, do you know, it's interesting you mentioned the scale of the map there because actually, if you look at a standard map of the world, which we would all kind of generally recognise, I guess, Russia actually looks much bigger than Africa, but it's not necessarily a true reflection of the distance when you're on the ground, in fact.
Is that anything to do with the way maps are skewed off the globe to fit onto a flat page? Because if you think of degrees of longitude and latitude, and we could get terribly geeky about this.
You can, and there's actually, I think, my understanding is there's kind of two projections. So we're all used to a kind of Cater projection, which we'd all recognise as the kind of world map. But actually, there's also a slightly different projection of the global map called the Peters projection.
So if you think if I went east around the world, both times I pedalled around the planet, because most of the continents and countries have a prevailing westerly wind. And that's why the sailing boats, typically when they're going for the records, go west to east as well. But I mean, back in the Victorian times, they defined the international dateline. And so they properly wrapped their heads around and created, I mean, they'd already always knew it existed to a point with sailors and whatnot. But defining the international dateline, if you go back to the original Round the World in 80 Days, the Phileas Fogg story, that was the that was the big sort of cliffhanger at the end of it. He thought he'd come home in 81 days and he'd actually done it in 80, because as you race eastwards around the planet, you're actually living days that are slightly shorter. And then you make back that time when you cross the international date line. So because I was doing 1,000 miles every 4 days, on average, I was living days that were 23 hours and 45 minutes. And so I lived slightly short days for 2.5 months. And then I lived day 37 twice. Does that make any sense at all? So it feels like you're living entire days because you go through days and you go through nights. But actually, because you're chasing the sun eastwards around the planet, you experience days slightly shorter than they are because you're not standing still. And if this is messing with your head, we spent untold time trying to figure out how to optimize our time around the planet, because it doesn't sound like much losing 15 minutes a day, but it makes a massive difference when you're only sleeping 5 hours a night, and 5 minutes on the bike makes a big difference. So time is split up evenly around the planet going that way in terms of longitude. But then, as you say, latitude, it slightly changes because as you go towards the poles, blah, blah, blah. So we would have to, I can just tell people are falling asleep as we chat about this, but bear with me, guys. As you go further north from the equator, then your degrees of longitude get closer together, so your time difference becomes less. So the closer we were to the equator on our race, the more time we had to take off our days. If that's left you confused, then likewise.
Plenty of geography teachers there to support everyone, I'm sure. But it does make a big difference. And of course, you covered the Africa. I think you set the Africa record, and was it 41 days back in 2016? How long did it take?
10 hours and 22 minutes, to be exact.
How long did it take you to cover the sort of similar distance through Russia before you crossed into Mongolia?
So I think I crossed in. You've got me on the hop here, but I think I crossed from Russia into Mongolia roughly on day 24, 25. It took me 17 days to cross Russia and a week to cross Europe. So yeah, that's about right.
So kind of less than half the time really to cover a sort of similar distance. I mean, that's
So going down, it's interesting because there was a point where I'd covered the equivalent distance as Cairo to Cape Town, length of Africa. And I thought, my goodness, this has only taken me 24 days or whatever it was. And it had taken me 41 days when I was going down the length of Africa, which is extraordinary. But then again, when I was racing down Africa, I was completely alone. I was unsupported. And I was very much limited by riding daylight hours, which for the African continent is a very exact 12 hours. It gets light at 6 a.m. and it gets dark at 6 p.m. On the equator, I mean, the sun falls out the sky. You can watch it. It's extraordinary. And up here in Scotland, we're used to sunrise and sunset taking a matter of an hour or even 2 hours. Whereas, closer to the equator, it drops out the sky and sunrise happens zoom like that. Extraordinary. It's like somebody switched the lights on. So I didn't have those limitations going around the world. I was fully supported. So I was racing faster with no weight on the bike, and I was riding into the dark, early and late, which meant that I was averaging 240 miles a day rather than 160.
I'm sure John will tell us a little bit more in a second, but the temperatures through North Russia and Siberia can obviously vary tremendously, and as we'll hear also, the plants have obviously evolved to survive those changing conditions. What were the conditions like for yourself going through Russia?
Well, I'd done all sorts of testing in the climate chamber and acclimatized myself for hot summer riding. In fact, it was a bit like Scotland. It was a wee bit overcast, a bit dreich. It was a bit wet most of the time. It was like a Scottish summer. I was really expecting, especially where you're so landlocked in the middle, to have those extremes. We always think of like central Canada having, proper seasons, a really deep winter and a really hot summer. I thought Russia would be the same. In fact, it stayed pretty middle teens in terms of temperatures. Sure, we had a few warm days, but it was pretty familiar to home, to be honest.
Northern Russia and Siberia is, just this fantastic, enormous expanses of what's called boreal forest or taiga, Taiga. which are predominantly conifers, which have evolved in a sort of with their branches pointing downwards, like on a Christmas tree, so that they shrug off snow, they don't break under the weight of snow, that they just in over enormous distances, and some of them they have adapted to living in and around permafrost, so that they have very, very shallow roots, and manage to support themselves on very, very shallow roots. So that's, I think, an interesting biome. Enormous changes in temperature, so you can go down to you can have literally 100 degrees centigrade sort of variation between the coldest it gets and the hottest it gets. So the hottest it gets would probably be about 40 degrees C, and it goes down to minus 60 in the very, very cold parts of winter. I mean, it's just ridiculous that something...
You definitely need two wardrobes there.
Incredible that an organism can survive. When it gets towards winter, they need to replace any water with in their sort of vessels above ground with antifreeze, effectively. Towards China, you've got these sort of much more temperate, quite humid environments in parts of China. Of course, it's a very big country with a long span from north to south, so you've got different ecosystems, different biomes there. One of my favourite trees in China is oddly enough called the Japanese lacquer tree, and it has. I don't know if you've been to North America and come across poison ivy, but it's a distant relative of that, and it's got this very, very poisonous sap, which people have used to make lacquer material, which is you sort of paint it onto a surface in layers, and it's like a plastic. And 1,000 years ago, before there were any plastics, this was an amazing waterproof plastic-like material, and people make the most beautiful, beautiful lacquerware, which is highly decorated and beautiful colours and things. But also, there's these sect of monks. They're ascetics, which means that they have a very sort of simple life, and up until about 1900 or so, when it was made illegal, they used to drink the sap, a tea made out of this sap, and sort of plasticize themselves while they were alive. It was a kind of self-mummification. The idea was that they would reach Buddhahood. Their bodies, they became very emaciated. They died, and when they were dug up 3 years later, if they hadn't, their bodies were so poisonous that maggots couldn't live in them, so they wouldn't decompose. And when they were dug up, if they hadn't decomposed, that was a sort of path to instant Buddhahood. Now, as queer as folk, as we say down here.
Cheating the system a little bit there, I suspect.
Maybe.
Well, once you cut south out of Russia, the change in terms of geography is remarkable. And I don't know enough about the history to understand that. But once you climb up, and you do climb up into Mongolia, onto the Mongolian steppe, and then through Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital, and into the Gobi Desert in the south, I mean, it's treeless, it's fenceless, it's pretty sparse. I mean, Mongolia is an extraordinarily empty landscape. So you definitely drop out of that. When you go north to south, and I reflect on when I did the Alaska Tierra del Fuego ride, which is a 9-month ride from top to bottom, how you go through these hemispheres. As you say, you go through the forested bands in the north and the south, and then you get to the semi-arid sections, you get through the tropical sections. It's amazing how you can split the world into these bands. And going into that sort of semi-arid stretch, and then, the desert. Through the Gobi Desert, it's extraordinarily dry, as you'd imagine. And then reflecting that, 3-4 days earlier, I'd been going around Lake Baikal, the world's largest lake of its kind, and surrounded by dense conifers, and then racing for the flight out of Beijing was extraordinary, because Inner Mongolia is actually a part of China. And then once you start to get to the suburbs and head to Badalang and the Great Wall of China, it's all incredibly developed. It's built up. It's hard to find empty space. And, the suburbs and the human impact on that section of northern China is incredible.
Phileas Fogg travelled primarily by steamboat and train. However, Mark had cycled the whole way from Paris to Beijing in China before he was required to get his first flight from Beijing directly south to Perth in Western Australia.
When we think of Australia, we tend to think of the heat, but, going through Western Australia, you're right off the Southern Ocean there. So I've never experienced winds the way I have in the likes of Patagonia and Australia. There's just nothing to stop it. And everyone in the sailing world talks about the roaring 40s and the ferocious nature. But there's far less landmass and mountain ranges to break up, these great winds which are circling the planet. So Australia is a pretty barren, open, wild space in the middle of winter when the weather picks up. So yeah, sure, it gets a wee bit cold in the mornings and whatnot, but the main battle across the Nullarbor, which is the section in the middle, if you think that, the southern part of America is like a bridge, it comes down in Western Australia, it certainly comes down in the more inhabited part in the east past Adelaide and around the coast of Melbourne up to Sydney, and then you've got Brisbane. But that section in the middle where it comes up in the middle of the bridge is called the Great Bight. You've got these incredible sea cliffs that drop to the ocean below, and the Nullarbor Plain, which literally translates from the Aboriginal, which is the plain of no trees. That's exactly what it means. And so you've got this expanse where there's the odd roadhouse to get between, but apart from that, it's just you and the odd kangaroo.
Australia is a vast landmass consisting of a number of different biomes, and John picked out an interesting Australian tree which at one time could be found on the streets of Glasgow and London.
One of the things about Australia is that unlike New Zealand or Ireland, where plants have evolved there without having that many things that attack them and eat them, Australia, everything is out to get you. Australia is just absolutely crammed solid with poisonous snakes, poisonous things with sort of really sharp spines, stuff that's plants that are full of poisons, and they're all trying to defend themselves basically. And in Southwest Australia, a lot of the trees there have developed defences which involve having resins. These resins are often very fragrant to us. The resinous trees are nice things to have around. So that in the Middle East, thousands of years ago, people were using the cedar of Lebanon for making sarcophagi for Egyptian pharaohs, for making ships and boats, for making things that you really wanted to last, because those resins are fragrant to us, but they're poisonous to termites and to insects and also fungi that might cause them to degrade over time. So in Southwest Australia, we have the jarrah tree with this wonderful, very heavy wood, wonderful resin that became the tree for paving. So before we had asphalt and tarmac on the roads, people needed to do something about dirt roads, and they used to use stone, but that wasn't great for horses. So then they started putting wooden flooring down on streets, and they used this in Britain. They used this very cheap wood from the Baltic that they called deal, but it was basically a sort of fir tree. And as horses and carts went over it, it would rot. And you had all this sort of horse pee and rain, and cartwheels would sort of squish it all and then inject it in great sort of fountains over passers-by. It wasn't very popular. And so when someone suggested that they use jarrah wood instead, even though it came from literally the other corner of the world. It actually went down pretty well. And unfortunately for the jarrah tree, because people went prospecting for it and essentially chopped down huge jarrah forests. They went to the streets of cities like London and I believe Glasgow as well, and paved some of the swankiest streets in jarrah wood. So there were, miles and miles and miles of London streets were paved with jarrah wood, which wore down only very, very slowly, and it was this sort of resinous wood and did really well in the rain and so on. And that only stopped when tarmac came along in the sort of 1910s, 1920s.
Mark cycled west to east along the southern coast of Australia to Melbourne, where he turned north up the west coast, through New South Wales, past Sydney to Brisbane, before catching another flight to New Zealand, arriving in Invercargill on the south coast and cycling north to Auckland.
So people always, talk about, their year out and their travel and going and find somewhere exotic, and we're off to New Zealand. And I always say you will love New Zealand, but don't expect to be that amazed because it's very familiar for a Scottish person.
In New Zealand, there's the kauri tree, Kauri, huge columns, grey columns, enormous trees, fantastic thing. That over the course of thousands of years, the resin from those trees accreted and sort of formed lumps. And then in the 19th century, when the Americans were having a gold rush in California, New Zealand has a resin rush, and 10,000 prospectors from all over the world came and to collect these big lumps of resin, which were very valuable because they could use them back in Europe for making varnish. And so all the outdoor varnish was being made using this resin. But people used to find by sort of tapping a long metal rod into the ground and then twanging it. And by the tone of the twang, they could tell whether there was a nice big lump of resin down there. And some of these lumps of resin would be, 25, 30 kilos, like really big. Unfortunately, then they started slashing the trees to make more resin. And, we know where that led.
Deforestation in New Zealand was a significant problem. And thankfully, in 1991, a major Act of Parliament was passed to give legal protection to the natural environment as part of an ongoing effort to protect New Zealand's native forests. Mark caught another flight to Anchorage in Alaska before pedalling west towards Canada, into the United States, past Minneapolis, before cutting back into Canada north of Chicago as he powered towards the east coast and his final flight out of Nova Scotia.
Alaska is proper pioneer country, and it still is. So if you talk about Anchorage itself, it's like any North American city built on a grid system, very just full of generic brands and shops that you'd recognize. It's not that remarkable a place, but as soon as you step out, you're in the wilderness. And I absolutely love it, looking up into the Denali Ranges, up to Talkeetna, and heading east up to Tok Junction, where you've got an option to go north to the northern parts of Alaska, or head east. And then it's another 600 miles before you're off the Alcan Highway, which again is one of these amazing trunk roads, which nobody's turning right or left. Nobody's going anywhere else. Everyone's going across. And in the winter, it's an ice road. So it's built on permafrost. And just an amazing. It's amazing when you cycle through very busy parts of the world. People always ask you why. Why are you riding the bike? Where are you going? What's your purpose? What are you doing? When you travel through Alaska and the Yukon, nobody ever asks you why you're taking on a journey like this, because everyone has a story. Everyone is doing something in life which there's none of this whole, this is what we're meant to do, and there's like a format to life, and there's an institution you fit within. Now, for good or bad, that's not a criticism. It's just an observation, having traveled to 130 countries over the last 15 years, that the more populated and busy places, the more people look at you and go, why are you doing what you're doing? Whereas I think people in really rural parts of the world, like Alaska, have still got that pioneering spirit. They've still got that sense of, well, what I'm doing is sacred to me. And what I'm doing is something I've chosen to do. It's not a cultural norm. It's not like something which is expected. I've chosen to do this. And so people never question your motivation, which I think is lovely. I don't know what that means in terms of the wider context, but even though I meet far fewer people through these parts of the world, I find a great kinship from even people who haven't traveled, but just have a huge interest in travelers and the world, because, they've got that. I find you've got people with a twinkle in the eye, people who can still craft, people who can still, survive hard winters. They've just got a bit of a grit and a wry smile and a dark humor about them. So, yeah, I love Alaska. I've done a number of expeditions up there, and I love the wilderness. And I guess reflecting back on trees, the once you're into the wilds of Alaska and Canada, it's just a corridor of trees. You've got billions of trees and millions of bears and not much else. A few people.
Keep pedaling fast at that point. And I guess arriving on the East Coast, knowing that you were getting on that final flight back to Europe and getting so close to the finishing line must have felt pretty exciting. But before we get back on the plane, let's go back to John and hear a little bit about the amazing colours of the trees along that East Coast in America during the autumn months.
The features of autumn in the northeast coast of the USA and southwest and southeast Canada is the most fantastic colouring of the leaves. And there's the maples and other trees have this just they go every colour of sort of yellow and red. It's just amazing. And one of the questions is, why, if you plant the same trees in Britain, don't you get that fantastic range of colours? They drop their leaves in winter, to save resources and so on. And we know why the trees change colour. It's because essentially the tree is withdrawing some of the chlorophyll components and other chemicals that it needs, that it can recycle. And by withdrawing those chemicals, it leaves the red and yellow chemicals behind that aren't so easily recycled, and the tree jettisons some of those. So we know that. But why in England particularly, and even in Scotland, there's a clue, do we not get the same range of colours as in Canada? And the answer seems to be that you get these really, really bright chemicals when you have very large extremes of temperature. And of course, England particularly, to some extent Scotland, are temperate. We have maritime climates that are fairly temperate. So in autumn, the temperature range is not as big as it is in Canada. And that temperature range seems to affect the way that the trees, the way and the rate at which the trees sort of withdraw the sort of the goodness back from the leaves that they're going to recycle, and therefore changes the sort of colouring that we see of the leaves.
So we've landed in Lisbon. How did you feel knowing you were just over 1,000 miles from Paris in the finish line?
It felt extraordinary to be in the final 1,000 miles. The sheer relief to have had that final flight out of the way. That final leg across North America had taken a real toll. It was Groundhog Day. It just was 5,500 miles. And you can split North America into 3 chapters geographically. You've got the mountains on the west, mountains and trees, the forests. You've got the great prairies, the grasslands, the flatlands in the middle. And then in the east, you've got, the Great Lakes, and the back into the woodlands and whatnot. So like beautiful sections which I've explored, like through Algonquin Park and, up through the East Coast, Nova Scotia. Reflecting on, those colours through the fall. They're world famous. But there's nothing like home. And by that, I mean, landing back in Lisbon, a place that I know very little about, it still felt far more like home than, where I'd been in the US. Forget a common language. Forget the fact that I speak English as they do in North America. I felt far more at home in Portugal, just culturally. and that sense of we're in the final 5 days and the final this, the final that. I started to count off all the finals. So, very quickly crossing into Spain, racing for Madrid, turning north, heading up over the Pyrenees. I mean, Spain is the second most mountainous country in Europe. So we always think they keep their mountains up in the north, but it's a tough old ride. And then the final miles up through the Bordeaux region and heading into Paris. It was hugely exciting.
We're going to take one final pit stop to allow John to tell us about the cork oak ecosystems before we cross the finish line.
In some ways, it's not a completely natural ecosystem. The human beings have tended those cork oaks because cork is a very valuable commodity for wine bottles, for making corks with. The tree has evolved cork because it's a protection against fire. And unusually, it's something that, mostly if you remove the bark of a tree, it kills it. But the cork oaks can regenerate their bark. So human beings have found this wonderful, sustainable way of using trees, using their bark, harvesting it at such a rate that the trees just grow it back. Which is great for wine. It's also great for the trees because there are plenty of them there. And it's great for the things that live in and around the trees. So another part of this sort of ecosystem is that the acorns from the oaks are fed on by pigs that they keep that run around there in the wild, having a decent life until, of course, they're killed for their meat, for their ham, which is a sort of very famous and very, I'm told, I've not had it, but very delicious kind of ham. And there are a whole lot of deer, lots of different kinds of birds, lots of different kinds of insects that all coexist in this ecosystem that kind of depends on human beings needing to cork their wine bottles. And this is why if you buy wine, or if your parents buy wine, you should encourage them to use wine bottles that have actually been plugged with proper cork stoppers and not plastic ones or screw tops, because it's actually supporting a whole ecosystem and supporting a kind of way of life there as well, which I think is a nice, sustainable thing.
Did you open a cork when you arrived in Paris, Mark?
Yes, I did. I'd bantered with one of my sponsors for months. He'd said, "What do you want most at the finish?" And I said, "A nice glass of red." And he presented that at the reception the evening we finished. And I think this is one of the final lines of my book. I said, and it was the truth, it tasted absolutely disgusting. I was so shattered. My body was so messed up by what I'd put myself through. I'm blaming my taste buds, not the wine. But that thing I'd craved for months and months and months was bogging, and I couldn't finish it.
And I guess the one question that everyone really wants to ask, Mark, is how sore was your bum after 78 days and 18,000 miles in the saddle?
Everything hurt. Absolutely everything hurt. But it's extraordinary, the conditioning, the body's ability to adapt over time, it's not, I untold hurt over 1,200 hours racing my bicycle, but the body's got an amazing way of sort of healing, and nothing permanent, you'll be glad to hear.
And this summer, of course, most of us will not have any travel plans at all. Where would you recommend in Scotland? I'm
biased to home, which for me was growing up in rural Perthshire. So my favourite memories are, climbing the Ben Lawyers Ridge, around Loch Tay, heading up through parts of Glen Shee and the likes. But, where's not to love? We live in a small country with such a diversity of geography, and it's, for an adventurer, just the perfect playground.
I guess sometimes you have to go right around the world to realise that some of the best bits are at home.
Yeah.
Listen, Mark, thank you. I guess thank you so much. Obviously, biology, not your favourite subject at school. You yourself are not a biologist. You're not a scientist, but what you do is you do inspire people all across the country by your own achievements, by the adventures that you go on, by pushing boundaries and by overcoming big challenges. And hopefully for our young people that are listening to the podcast to go on and follow their own dreams and carve their own path once they leave school. We certainly don't expect everyone studying higher biology to be a biologist.
No, I don't think we need. I don't think we need everyone to cycle around the world either. We just need people to enjoy what they do and be passionate about it. And you can come at that from all sorts of directions.
Thank you very much for your contributions. It's hugely appreciated as always, because you obviously do a huge amount to support schools and pupils across the country over a number of years. And with whatever is coming next and your own challenges, good luck, I guess.
Thanks, Paul. Keep up the great work with the podcast.
As Jules Verne wrote in his book, anything one man can imagine, other men can make real. It's up to us all to follow our own dreams and work hard to make them a reality. Many thanks also to John Drori for highlighting some of our planet's amazing trees throughout our journey. And remember, you can get 40% off all Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers using the discount code LeckyPodcast40 online at www.leckyscotland.co.uk.